Welcome back to Shabbat Night Live. Tonight, you are in for a treat because we are going to answer some questions you've had for your whole life. For example, what is the meaning of life? Where does money come from? Why does money cause divorce? What are the 4 types of people? And are all of those people destined to be entrepreneurs? Good questions, and we have a great guest to answer those questions. He is an author. He is a national syndicated radio host. And Annie, what else? I mean, your family's been involved in entrepreneurship, but what else is our guest done?
No, he's a teacher. He's a motivational speaker. He's a mentor of mine, somebody that I greatly respect. And so we have Josh Tolley. We're so excited to have you join us
Welcome.
now.
Pleasure. It is a pleasure.
Especially during this time of year. It's the beginning of our fiscal year for a lot of business owners, but it's also the time that we budget for vacations and we start considering life, those New Year's resolutions.
And maybe you want to do something different this year, do something better than you did last year, right?
We should always want to be better than last year.
We should. You know, then what's interesting about that, that's actually what got me started. I remember I was sitting across the table from a couple in their 30s, and they went to bed every night thinking, is this all my life is? And so many believers, year after year, is this it? Is this really all that God had for me? So yeah, I completely agree. Great time to bring up this topic.
So what is money? Where did money come from?
Well, it's interesting, you know, money is something that we have a lot of opinions on. It's one of those 3 things that you're not supposed to talk about: politics, religion, and money. And money is one of those, and because we have such a daily need and use of it, a lot of us form opinions that are kind of contrary to what it's really supposed to be. So if we look at the history of money, it was just supposed to be a medium that represented something else. So let's say, Scott, you made pottery, and you made furniture, and I had farm eggs. Well, if we were going to engage in commerce, I would have to bring all of my eggs to see you every time in hopes that you wanted them, and then that would get labor intensive. And you'd have to bring your furniture every time we traveled, so you need a truck to bring it all with you. So people realized quite quickly, this isn't the way to do it. So they used money, which at the time was either rice, grain, seashells. We've used sticks in the past.
Wow.
But we use this medium that represents something else. And that was the way it was for a very long time. And all money really is it's a medium of exchange between people engaged in commerce. Now, in the past 100 years or so, we've had a third-party element valuing it for us, which some people think is bad, some people think is okay. But either way, we get the value from another entity, but we still engage in it. All it is a representation of something larger. Money in and of itself really is nothing, which is why God talks about it so much, because He wants us to have a proper understanding that it isn't something in and of itself. It is just a tool that represents something else.
Well, that leads to another good question. As Christians, should we care about money? Should we even have money? What is our relationship supposed to be like with money?
Well, it's interesting. You know, a lot of Christians love to say money doesn't matter, but it does to God. God talks more about money than He does salvation. He talks more about how to spend it than He does heaven. So if it was important to God, important enough to put in Holy Scripture, then we at least have to get to this point where we say it's supposed to matter. I think where we've gone wrong is in Christendom. We've gotten either prosperity gospel, which is some sort of weird, you know, buy my magic handkerchief, become a millionaire, or some poverty gospel where money doesn't matter at all, but don't forget to tithe on your way out the door. So we've gotten these 2 crazy extremes, and gone is what God actually wanted us to see in it. And it was a tool, a medium of exchange that allows His people to further themselves. And He's never hated it, contrary to what Christianity has kind of adopted. He's never hated money. I mean, think about it. As soon as Adam and Eve left the garden, He gave them a way to provide for themselves, a provision, which means there had to be a way for exchange. And He even knew that, which is why we see Cain and Abel giving sacrifices. You sacrificed something that was important, in this case, a blood offering or something, or a first fruits. Well, that was money. They used grain and sheep as a way to exchange. So even that first sacrifice, even though a lot of Christians don't want to admit it, that has an element of being money in it just from the very beginning. And then we see the Hebrew slaves leave Egypt, and does God say, oh, just leave all your stuff behind? No. He says, not only are you going to take your stuff, you're going to take all theirs too. So if money's not important, then why does God continually use it from Genesis to Revelation?
Do you think it's a misunderstanding of where people say, well, money is the root of all evil, and that's not even the right quote?
No.
Is that where we get, I mean...
Oh my gosh. I am so glad you brought that up because what this reveals to us is a lot of Christians, unfortunately, and even more unfortunate, a lot of Christian pastors wouldn't be able to pass a third grade English class. And I don't say that mockingly. I remember in third grade English that the teacher would give you a sentence and a red pencil and say, circle the action word. Well, most Christians would circle the word money. Well, the action word in that sentence is love, the love of money. So we have to take a look and say, well, what is love, right? Like that 80s song, what is love? but in reality, when we look at love, love is something like, let's say you love your spouse to be. You spend as much time with them as possible. You think about them all the time when you're not with them. When they're mad at you, it ruins your day, right?
Yeah.
Well, now let's replace spouse or loved one or fiance with money. How do you love money? You spend all of your time making it. You think about it all the time. When it's not happy with you, i.e. debt, it ruins your day. So a lot of us love money in our poverty. And we love to pass it off and say, well, I don't love money. I don't have a lot. Irrelevant. He didn't say those who have a lot is the root of all evil. He says the love of money is the root of all evil. And it comes as a shocker to many believers that we are loving money in our poverty.
We just had church people.
Preach it.
No, but really, money is a subject that many people are scared about.
Oh, yeah.
Especially as believers. And we don't want to be judged by one another. And it's almost like, well, a taboo subject, like you said, like
Sure.
politics. So my question is, where did the biblical or let me ask this. What is our current economy?
Okay.
And then what was it supposed to be? What is the biblical economy?
That is such a great question because it's actually more than one answer. See, a lot of people don't even understand what the economy is. We turn on the nightly news and they say the economy is good or they say the economy is bad. But I actually taught a class. Everybody in the room had an MBA, all MBA graduates. And I asked them what the economy was and none of them had an answer. And I thought, wait a second, if you're all MBAs, Masters in Business Administration, and you don't know what the economy is, then what are we even doing here? Like, how are we saying, oh, the economy's bad, I shouldn't get a house? So I started asking just general people on the street, what's the economy? Oh, well, it's the thing with the money, and sometimes it's good. Okay, can you take me to it? Can you show me this economy? And well, how do you know if it's good or bad? The guy in the news told you? So what we need to realize is the economy is really just like a thermometer. It's a test to gauge how much exchange is happening. The more exchange that is happening for the mutual benefit of the person selling and the person buying, the greater the economy. But that means we don't have one. We have millions. So let's say there's the American economy. It's good, it's bad, hey, whatever. But if you just got fired, your economy is terrible. If your city just got a bunch of new entrepreneurs to do startups, the city economy might be great, but statewide it might be terrible. So we need to realize that our economy really starts at home. How are we doing? And this is what I liken it to. Whenever we worry about the economy, we have to treat it like we're on an airplane. When I came out to see you guys, I got on an airplane, and they said in the case of an emergency, oxygen masks will deploy from the ceiling. Put your oxygen mask on first. So whenever we say, well, is the economy bad? The first place you have to look is inside your door. If inside your door, the economy's not bad, okay. But here's the other part of that. We're not supposed to walk in fear.
That's right.
So when the television tells us the economy's bad, why does everybody get afraid? And to be honest, great economic opportunity is present when the economy is bad. Because when the bad economy exists, it allows entrepreneurship to thrive. And this is what I love to explain to people. If you're an employee, then every night on the nightly news and they say the economy is bad, I'd worry a little bit. But when you're an entrepreneur, there's nothing to worry about because entrepreneurs create the economy. Every situation, every culture, every political system, entrepreneurs always are the engine to the economy. So as an entrepreneur, when I see the economy's bad, I say, okay, time to lace up my shoes and go to work because I get to create it. The only thing they're measuring is what I do anyway. So why are we letting the person with the thermometer tell me how the health is? Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense. That's a different perspective than what we were taught in science class, social studies, and everything else in school, which, I mean, the education system is a whole other subject in itself.
It is. But then to answer the second question about the biblical economy, and this is where it gets really fascinating for believers. And it's something that I actually learned with Michael years ago. We were sitting together with some people from the Christian Chamber. So we see that Muslims come into a community, and with just 3% population, they can kind of take over and control the community. And to their credit, well done. I mean, you did something right, right? So with 3%, they take over a community. How do they do that? Entrepreneurship. The Muslim economy, a dollar will go hand to hand in that economy 14 to 16 times before it leaves the Muslim community and goes into the general American population. And that's how they're so powerful. In the Jewish community, that's 10 to 12 times inside that community before it will go into the general population. In the American Christian population, it's zero.
Wow, really?
Zero exchanges. Do we say, well, if I need grapes, is there a Christian store that sells grapes? Instead, we say, well, Walmart has a sale on grapes. And then we wonder why in Christianity, the economy, the biblical economy doesn't exist. And what we are seeing in churches across the country is actually an adverse effect. We have more Christians declaring bankruptcy than graduating college. 7,000 churches a year get foreclosed on. When it comes to divorce, that's an issue too. We'll maybe talk about that a little bit later. But you have tithing at all-time record lows. Why? If the Bible tells us to be in the world but not of it, then why are we suffering the consequences of the economy that the world is teaching us instead of forsaking the one that God prescribed? And that's the one we need to talk about because that's the one we got away from.
I completely agree. And I see that as a small business owner. Well, thankfully, we're no longer small. But as a business owner, I see that we try to support local businesses as much as we can. Like in our household, we avoid going to Walmart or any big chain as often as we can for anything that we're purchasing for that very reason, because we want people to support us and we're to lead by example. And so we try to go into the local community or local business and support them as much as we can. But I agree with you, that's a very good concept that I hadn't thought about as a Christian. How many times do we look for another Christian business to do business with?
Right. Right. And as much as we love to say to these other communities, oh, shame on you, even if we look back in history, the Jewish population would get in trouble with the host country because what? They became economically prosperous and everybody else was like, hey, how did you get all the money? Well, this is how they got all the money. They were entrepreneurs. And we used to teach that in this country. I have a textbook from 1929. It's a 7th grade textbook. And in 7th grade, we taught, 11, 12-year-olds? We taught them as soon as you graduate school, you start a business. That was the default career. Well, now it is completely the opposite, especially in church. So the world is telling us, go to school, go to college, get good grades, get a job. Then church is saying, go to school, go to college, get good grades, get a job. And then we wonder why we're suffering the consequences of massive employment. And then people come into church saying, help me. And we say, do the same thing the world said. Just slap a cross on it, you'll be fine. And then the non-believer says, well, why would I listen to you about anything if you don't understand how the worldly works? Which is exactly what Yeshua says. He says, if you don't understand the earthly, you're not going to understand the heavenly. So non-believers come into a church, whether it's a building or a small group, and they say, help me. And we tell them the same thing that the world told them.
It's no different.
It's no different.
And it's a real shame because we are supposed to be greater. We're supposed to be leaders. We're supposed to be the business owners. We're supposed to be kings and queens and heirs to the throne. And at very times, we don't act that way. Like you said, there's a lot of foreclosure going on right now. There's a lot of debt.
Right.
As a whole, as a population. I can only imagine that the Christian population is not exempt from that.
No. Matter of fact, it's almost emphasized because now when I go and speak at churches, they have kiosks in the lobby where you can just, put your tithe on a credit card. You can actually get into debt to tithe. Or worse yet, you have pastors that tell you to tithe your way out of debt. Well, where's that in Scripture? So as much as it hurts, and this is the funny thing about this topic, this issue hurts. There are going to be viewers right now that feel like I just kicked them in the gut, right? Well, what that hurt actually is conviction. It is the lie leaving your body. And they're going to yell things like, oh, it's not about money and you don't chase riches. We aren't talking about riches. We're just talking about who controls you. Do you control the money or does the money control you? And right now, the money is controlling the people. There's no way to flip it, spin it. We can't argue our way out of it. The money's controlling us.
And your first book, Quit Your Job or Die, which I love. I
Thanks.
honestly love it. It's fun to read, funny to read, and just an easy read. You made a point about that very topic in one of your first chapters on being controlled by money,
Right.
you know, and how are we financially free? And how do we know? And most of us are not, because we can't do what we want. Like you explained, you know, you're not able to live the life that you want, spend the money that you want. It's still some kind of hindrance that's preventing you from that.
Yes. And interestingly enough, in the Bible, it talks about, you know, God gives the power to create wealth. And a lot of pastors will stop right there, but there's a comma there and it continues. And as we know, there were no commas. So what does the rest of the sentence actually say? It says, I give you the power to create wealth as a sign of my covenant. Well, are we not still under a covenant? So how does this sign go away? But people, again, will want to reject that and say, well, it's not all about money. It's not all about money. I agree. It's not. But then stop working 40 hours a week for money. And this is where we get a little hypocritical. We love to say, well, money's not important. Then why do you leave the important things in life to go make it?
That's a good point.
And it's funny how the people who tell me that money's not important are the people without it. Every billionaire I've ever met says, Josh, I don't even think about money. Money at that point becomes like air. When you have enough of it, you don't think about it. But
I hope to get there one day.
you're on your way. But when you don't have any of it, it's the only thing you think about. And as pious as we want to sound, money's not that important. Well, as soon as your kid needs new shoes for school and you have to think, well, what do we cut in order to get them?
Yeah.
Money has become important. As soon as you have to have a water pump go out on the car, and because of that, you can't make it to go minister to somebody, money has become important. And what's almost just a stick in the eye, sort of hypocritical, is I went and spoke to a room full of men, Christian men. And I said, okay, men, how many of you have children? Oh, hands go up. If your daughter came home and said, Daddy, I'm in love, I want to marry this guy, what is the first question you ask him? How are you going to take care of my daughter? But I thought money wasn't important. You know, why does Jesus say, hey, when I come back with what? Mistos and apodidomai, payment, repayment. Wait a second, so why does he even say he's coming with something to give you? So we have to really grasp this and kind of put on our big boy pants, because the reason why faith is dying is because we have abandoned this issue. We've left it to people on the poverty or the prosperity gospel, and we've vacated that property, so to speak. So of course that's the only two whacked out messages they're hearing, and they're not hearing the truth. And my position is God would rather have you poor, living under a bridge and with your family, than employed 40 hours a week without them. So when people say, oh, are you preaching be rich? Not even close. What I'm preaching is stop letting money control you. I'd rather have you broke and in God's word as opposed to chasing money 40, 50 hours a week.
Now, there's a question I've got. It kind of relates to the whole, you know, our churches are falling apart. Less and less people are going to church. You see that especially in Europe. Do you think there's any tie between that and then when you go to some Christian businesses that they don't get it? They think the people will just come to them because they're Christian, but they don't do a good job.
Right.
Is there some connection there where there's sort of a laziness that because we're Christian, it'll just happen and we don't have to try?
Yes, and that goes beyond just being Christian too. There's just a general laziness. We have become an internet-addicted sort of society. We think, well, all I need to do is create a Facebook page or a Twitter account and money cometh. No, you still have to be a skilled business person, which is why God says so much about being a business person. It's funny, quit your job or die is half the size of evangelpreneur. Evangelpreneur takes what God actually said about how to be a business person and puts it into context. So if we're going to study the skill set that Paul had, that Luke had, that Matthew had, that John had, that David had, well, that's a skill set that we used to teach in churches. We really did. We used to teach how to be an entrepreneur. Because everywhere west of Jamestown in this country, every church is the result of entrepreneurs. They knew it was important, and we've abandoned it.
So one thing that I want to share is, you know, we came from Mexico. My family and I, we were immigrants, and we came with just clothes on our back, and we actually slept on my father's boss's floor for like 6 months when we first arrived, and then we moved into an apartment where we had no bed and shared a can of food. I mean, it was that intense. And what I'm getting out of all of this is about creating your destiny.
Yes.
And that's what my parents saw the struggle, and they said, no more. and started their own business. Now with blood and sacrifice, a lot of hard work at the very beginning, but we've never been in need since. And that's how my husband and I too. I mean, we own a business, and that's how it was ingrained in us. Both my husband's parents, both mother and father, own their own business. That's just what we grew up with. We grew up with knowing and understanding that it's going to be a struggle, but it's worth it in the end because you have so much more freedom, not just financially, but you have freedom to take time off. You have freedom to go in late. You have freedom to go to your kid's recital if it's in the middle of the day. And freedom to, as you mentioned, talk on your phone. When you compared them to prisons.
Oh, yes, yes,
when you
yes,
compared
yes.
jobs to prisons. I mean, there's so much more freedom that comes with just being a business leader.
Yeah. And what I like to point out, too, is the parable of the men with the talents, right? What happened to the guy that just buried it?
Nothing.
Yeah.
He was
Not
reprimanded.
only was his taken away, but he was kicked out. He was punished. And his stuff was given to somebody else. Well, that's what we do. We say, money's not important, so I'm just going to bury it. I'm just going to work 40 hours a week, abandon wife and kids, and money's not important. Well, good luck with that. And why does Jesus continue to use parables of business owners? The laborers in the field. You know, so again and again and again, he's teaching us something that we want to ignore. And when you talk about putting in that sacrifice, you're going to have to pay for it now or later.
Yes.
I'd rather put in the labor now and have the reward and live the biblical lifestyle as opposed to saying, well, you know what, money's not important, so let me abandon the biblical lifestyle and work for somebody else 50, 40 hours a week.
Which is half of, or more than half of the hours that you're usually awake. I mean, that's how much time you spend at work. Believe me, I know, right, Scott?
Not to mention the commute on top of that. If you're having to go into some place and work, you know, you're taking even more time.
Yeah, no, for a long time I drove an hour to work and an hour home. I mean, that's 2 hours a day, that's 10 hours a week. And I mean, our jobs here at A Rood Awakening, we see it very differently. We see it as a service unto Jehovah and unto the people.
Sure.
But nevertheless, I mean, you have to go out there and make your own destiny, create your own life.
Yes, and one of the things that we have to clarify is somebody is going to say, well, I know entrepreneurs and they work even more hours than employees, only if they're doing it wrong. And that's what we have to teach. The reason why we see business owners working more hours than employees is because the entrepreneur is running his business as if he were an employee. They run it as, what do I do Monday through Friday? What service do I provide Monday through Friday? Well, then you're just a small business owner. You now become an employee of the thing you created. That's kind of like a Frankenstein scenario. And we've gotten away from working an entrepreneurship lifestyle. I tell people if you're working more than 30, maybe 35 hours a week in your business, you're doing it wrong. It's not that business doesn't work. You're not working your business correctly.
Wow.
That's very thought-provoking.
Yes, we're going to have to get into that in this series for sure. So now, you got me really thinking about that now. 35 hours a week as an entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
Really
would you say, think about this. Why would you say that all of these other things are more important than money? Yet all of those other things have to fit in the spare time that you have left over? Like, is that really how God did it? Did God say, hey, Moshe, before you lead these people out of Egypt, you have to go work 40 hours a week. So just lead them like a quarter mile a day and you'll get there in 40 years. Was that the plan? Or did he say, hey, I'm putting together an economic model that's going to sustain you in the wilderness so you can work it, well, they were trading, so you can work it whenever you need to engage in commerce. But other than that, you're going to do my will and my purpose.
I have a good question. So there's been a lot of opposition on this subject with Adam and Eve because Adam was cursed with tilling the ground. And that's their fighting argument, is that they were cursed to work. So is that true? I mean, is essentially work a curse? And if it is, then how is this contradicting that theology?
Well, we have to look at that and say, are we still living under a curse? Well, that's an interesting theological conversation, right? But even beyond that, it's how you work. You still have to put in hours, you still have to put in time, but you work smart instead of just hard. You say, hey, if I'm going to put in effort, how do I get the most yield? Any farmer would tell you this.
Yep.
I mean, the Bible tells us this. You know, hey, you cast this into the rocky soil, you're not going to get much. Cast it into the healthy soil, boom, it's going to multiply, right? So we need to do the same thing with our work. Am I doing something that's just going to pay me $20 an hour? If so, then I should never expect it to produce and yield great results. And instead, I say, well, Father, I threw my seed on terrible ground. Please bless it. He's telling you, I can't bless that. You threw it where you shouldn't have thrown it. So if you threw where you should, now one seed creates an entire stalk, which creates hundreds of more seeds. And that's how we're supposed to look at work. It's not that it's a curse. And it is, but it's not that the work part is the bad part. It's how do we address the work? And again, we think because we've been programmed since we start kindergarten, you have to do something 40 to 50 hours a week. Why? Where did that come from?
When did it start?
Well, okay, so I'll answer that. That actually did start someplace. And how we got a lot of that was when we had the Industrial Revolution in this country. Prior to that, school was reading, writing, arithmetic, a little bit of U.S. history, and then you were out by lunch. Well, along comes the Industrial Revolution, and you have these titans of industries approaching states saying, hey, I need just like my numb little employee people. Can you create somebody who can work in our factories? They're going to need to work from about 7:45 till about 3:45, because that's when my factory works. When do we go to school? So, and they need to learn a bunch of stuff. They don't really need to think. They just need to be able to replicate answers. So we went from a 7th grade textbook that taught us to start a business to now a 7th grade textbook that's this thick, and it's nothing but repetition, regurgitate the answer. So we create little employees. And because of that, when those little employees become business owners, they run their business as if they were an employee. So it's just it's a continuation of a problem that we are creating.
The Bible says that the love of money is the root of all evil. But you don't have to be rich to love or be concerned about money. Do you worry about losing your job? Are you concerned about having enough? Would you like to give more to ministries but just can't?
If you're an employee, then every night on the nightly news and they say the economy is bad, I'd worry a little bit. But when you're an entrepreneur, there's nothing to worry about because entrepreneurs create the economy.
In an eye-opening series on Shabbat Night Live, syndicated radio host, entrepreneur, and best-selling author Josh Tolley reveals the truth that believers are meant to be financial leaders and how to do it.
So when people say, oh, are you preaching be rich? Not even close. What I'm preaching is stop letting money control you.
Order Faith and Finances with Josh Tolley right now on DVD, Blu-ray, or USB. You'll get both episodes as seen on Shabbat Night Live. Order Faith and Finances now by phone or online.
Do we want to really support our school system the way it is this day and age? Because we were just talking about school, what kids learn in school before the break. And I know that I went to school, those hours, 8 to 3 or whatever it is, every day of my life. I went to normal school. And my kids have both been homeschooled, but they are far more entrepreneur-minded than I am. And they're racing ahead, and one's got a full scholarship to a university, and the other one's a budding entrepreneur. And I look at that kind of thing and go, oh, gee, that's too scary, and what if this and what if that? And they just go ahead with it. Is it because of the schooling I got, or what?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely it is. Because if you think about it, kids are naturally inclined to become entrepreneurs. You don't have to teach them how to do it. They figure it out on their own. They start trading baseball cards with their friends. Well, the baseball card becomes money. They learn how to do this all on their own because that's what God designed. God designed us to be entrepreneurs. Then we actually teach it out of them. So we teach them, oh, no, don't be an entrepreneur. There has to be a system. There has to be, go to school, get good grades. Well, there's a reason why even this past year, Vanderbilt University followed around a ton of valedictorians and whatever, second place people. You can tell I wasn't one of them. And they followed them around and said, okay, in 10 years, where do these people end up? And they found out that these people end up in a pretty precarious situation because they left school thinking there had to be a way to just replicate answers and keep getting rewards. Life doesn't work that way. And what they found was that A students work for B students work for C students manage the company that the D student owns. And your odds of becoming a millionaire are actually higher, no joke. Your odds of becoming a millionaire are actually higher if your grade point average was under 2.5. Because what you had to do is you had to get creative when it came to problem solving. You had to. In order to even get the D and get the diploma, you had to become creative. So now when you're in life and you have to pay rent, you automatically start to think, how do I get creative? And you start businesses. And it's such a powerful tool. And a great example of this and how we've lost it. So in 1929, like I mentioned, we had that textbook that taught kids, unless you were the dunce in the corner with the dunce cap on, you're going to leave and start a business. The dunce goes and becomes an employee. So we went from that to everybody's going to be an employee. Well, in the mid-'80s, when that generational switch is taking place, we're on the second generation of teaching everybody to become an employee, Legos almost goes out of business. And when you look at Legos, toy that's been around forever, they're thinking, well, they're still kids. Why are we going out of business? And what they discovered was nobody's playing with them because we taught the kids to lose their imagination.
Wow.
So then there was this guy at the boardroom of Legos, and he says, well, tell you what, guys, before we close this puppy down, just give me a month or two. Let's treat them the way they're being raised. If parents are going to raise little employees, let's treat them like little employees. So they came up with the first Lego kit that was something. See, before you could just buy a tub of Legos and make whatever your little imagination desired. We lost our imagination, so they released the pirate ship. So now in this box, this is what this is, kid. Be an employee, follow the instructions, and that's your playtime now. Now if you go to a big box store, you cannot buy a tub of Legos. They're all kits because we're raising little employees, so now they're even playing like little employees. But when you homeschool kids, it's way different because now they're figuring things out on their own, and they have this natural tendency to want what God provided, which was entrepreneurship. And it's funny how Christians love to criticize this topic and say, well, I trust the Lord to provide. Great, but the Lord loves us more than he loves a sparrow, right? Well, a sparrow doesn't just get to sit in his nest and magically, poof, birdseed ends up in his gut. He has to go out and get what God provided. Well, entrepreneurship is that tool. That is how you go out and get what God provided. Because if you're an employee, the only thing you're getting is a portion of what God provided your boss. So then that leads into an entirely dark place where we realize not only are we teaching our kids incorrectly, we're living incorrectly, and the Bible tells us do not be unequally yoked. And we love to say, well, that has something to do with marriage, right? Oh, that's marriage. Yes, it applies to marriage, but as listeners and viewers of this show know, Michael goes a little bit more in depth in that and actually talks about yoke is a method of work. When you yoke two oxen together and they're not equal, and one pulls ahead and breaks the neck of the other one, you actually kill the other ox. Well, okay, let's look at it from a work context. Let's say that I'm working for Anny. And just for example's sake, I say I'm the believer, money's not important, but I'm going to leave my wife for 40 hours to go make the non-important thing. And she's paying me. I am now yoked to her. What is she spending the money on? How many believers say, well, the Bible's important, yet never interviewed their boss to say, hey, boss, are you even a believer? Because think about it. If your boss is not a believer and they're spending money on drugs or prostitutes or whatever, then that means in order for me to pray to God and God, please bless me and give me a raise, my boss would have to be blessed by God, right? So God would have to bless my boss in his sin in order to give me a raise. Find that in Scripture. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about unequally yoked. But again, people are probably nervous in their seats and yelling at the TV right now because they're mad. And the reason they're mad is because it's the truth, and nobody likes the truth. But what do we know about the truth? It sets us free. So it's one of those painful topics that we have to talk about. And unfortunately, because we haven't, we've gotten to the place where we are.
No, I love this topic. You have no idea. Like I told you during the break, I have little happy emojis going on right now in my body because I just love the fact that we're addressing an issue that is ruining our lives as a whole, but as a people as well. It's crushing our dreams, our desires. Like you said, you feel fear when you're considering opening a business.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, that's a common thought.
Right, but like Josh just explained, and that made me feel a whole lot better because it's going out and getting what God has already provided.
That's
Yes.
right.
So it's not what if I can't get customers, what if? Never mind the what if, it's already there.
Right.
If you're a believer, it's intended for you, waiting for you.
And you can't tell me that God is with you in all things except business. So God is now your business partner. And there might be people say, well, yeah, but I had a business and it failed once. Employment is guaranteed to fail. There's no success option with employment because you only have three options. One, you die. Two, you retire and get a pension that's never going to work. And if we had time, I could explain how no pension has ever kept up with inflation. Or three, you get fired. So all three options, the only three options that are possible at your place of employment lead to failure. So when we see a business and they say, well, I tried that once and it failed, great, try again.
That's right.
Because at least this one holds the potential to succeed, whereas employment doesn't even have a shot. And then if you're going to be somebody who doesn't have the spirit of fear, but Spirit of God, then you have to start saying to yourself, well, then what am I actually afraid of? That he's not going to catch me? This is why he says, I'm a light unto your feet, not unto your path. Because he wants you to take a step right where you see your next step, and that takes faith. And that's what we don't want to do. If you look at most Christians, why don't you start a business? It's too risky. So you'd rather find security in your boss as opposed to security in your God? Good luck with that.
Now, let's, if we may, could we get into the 4 types of people?
Absolutely.
This seems like a great opportunity. You sort of set the stage here. So there are 4 types of people, and that end up in employment or making money one way or another. You're either this one, this one, this one, or this one.
Yeah.
What are they, and how do we determine where we fit?
Well, here's the interesting part. When I went to my Strong's Concordance and looked for employee, I couldn't find it. So I needed to figure out, why isn't an employee in the Bible, right? It's not in the Hebrew, it's not in the Greek, it's not in the Aramaic. So when I started researching this, I realized there's only 4 types of people in the Bible: masters, laborers, servants, and slaves. Masters, we understand, he's the rich guy on top of the hill, got it. Slaves, we understand, don't have a choice, right? Because you're whipped or whatever, you don't have an option. But that leaves us with 2, servants and laborers. Servants were not slaves. Now, this is a very big distinction. We love to say that they're the same people. They're not. Now, before we get into what it is, we need to get a little bit of context. The book of Matthew tells us that you cannot serve God and money. Not that it's a sin or not that it's a nan and a boo-boo. It says you cannot do it. It's impossible. You'll either love one, hate the other, hate one, love the other. So you cannot do it, okay? Now that we know that, let's go back to what a servant is, because if it's telling us that we cannot be a servant to God and money, again, circle the action word. What are we doing? Hey, we're being a servant. So let's figure out what that is. A servant in biblical times, they started their shift when the master told them to. When do you have to go to work? When you want to, or when the master says?
Mm-hmm.
A biblical servant would work an 8 to 10 hour shift. They were not a slave. They worked an 8 to 10 hour shift. How many hours do you work? The servant didn't get to go home when the job was done. If there's time to lean, there's time to clean. There's always another project right around the corner, right? So the servant only got to go home when the master said it's time to go home. When do we get to go home from work? The servant, if he saved up enough money, he could buy his freedom. Today we call that retirement. Oh, honey, if I could just save up enough money, I can get free. If the servant loved his master enough, and Michael actually teaches this, if the servant loved his master enough, he could go to the city gate, put an awl through his ear, take his master's mark, and be his for life. Today we call that tenure and pension. See, we are being servants to money through employment. And we love to say, I'm not a servant to money. Servant to money is one of those rich people and it rules their life. No, it's not. No servant had a lot. Kind of the clue that you were the servant was that you were the guy without the lot, right? So this idea that we are serving money in our poverty, that's what you are doing in employment. You don't control you, which means you are being controlled by something else other than God, because God would rather have you with your wife and kids. Nobody can disprove that. So he would rather have you with your wife and kids, so you are being a servant to money. It doesn't mean you have a lot. And then the worst part of all, not only are we being servants to money in our poverty, but we're teaching our children to do so. What does the Bible say about those who teach the young ones the wrong way, right? What does it say? Better a millstone tied around your neck than to cause one of these to stumble. Holy cow. So in Matthew, it tells us you cannot be a servant to God or to money and God, right? Mm-hmm. And then it tells us that if we teach against what he's saying, it's better a millstone be tied around our neck. And then yet for 40 hours a week, we go do the very thing he tells us not to do. So that's a servant biblically. Now, a laborer was a little bit different. A laborer was like those dudes, the Bible doesn't use the word dudes, but the laborer was those dudes who were coming to the field after those other guys were already in it, right? Jesus uses this as a parable. And Yeshua says what? They're getting paid what you're getting paid. And he uses it as a parable, you know, the guy who gets saved near the end of his life goes to heaven, just like the guy who gets saved early on. Got it, great. But why did he use that parable? Why does he say that the workers and the laborers, why are there two different distinctions? because one's a servant and one's an entrepreneur. As a laborer, an entrepreneur could say, hey, you need a field that needs to be plowed. I'll plow the field for X amount of money, and when the job's done, I'm out. And then you need fishing nets that need to be repaired, so tomorrow I'm expanding my skill set, fixing your fishing nets. I get to control my time. I get to control the hours I work. I get to spend time with my family. And if I want to save up and take 6 months off, I can, whereas a servant needs to save up enough money to buy freedom. So now the goal of freedom and being led by God is way closer than if I were a servant. And this is why he says, well done to you, good and faithful servant, because we're supposed to be his servants, not money's, which means we should be using money for his purpose. And that means if we're being employed to somebody for 40 hours a week, we're actually controlled by the boss's master, and who knows who he's serving.
So what is then the distinction between, because a laborer sounds to me like, okay, if you own a landscaping business, you are the owner of that landscaping business and your employees are the servants.
Sure.
So now who is the master in that kind of scenario?
Well, there's no master, there's just an employer.
Okay.
So now your master can be God, because now I'm only offering my services for a predetermined time, a predetermined rate, and a predetermined job. And people love to say, well, if that's the case, then who would fill the factories? Laborers. There is nothing legally stopping a factory from saying, hey, I want you to make 27 widgets. When you're done, go home. I just want 27 widgets. So we have been taught in our American mindset that, well, if roads are going to be built, if factories are going to be staffed, if stores are going to have workers, they're going to have to be employee workers. Lie. That is a lie from the devil. And it goes back to way in the beginning where he says, surely he didn't mean. Right? Because we are being led astray. We're being taught to be servants and saying, well, surely he didn't mean that's a servant. Good luck proving otherwise, because that's exactly where we are. And you can twist scripture any way you want it, but at the end of the day, let's just be honest. You're not giving as much to ministry, not because you don't want to, because you can't. You're not giving your family the education that they deserve, not because you don't want to, but because you can't. Anybody, see, this is where we get kind of messed up with this. Anybody will say, well, money's not important. Okay, then just do a simple experiment. Go find your fellow believer who didn't watch this program. First, tell them they need to watch the program. But beyond that, ask them, if you were to get a 10% raise at work, what do you do with it? All of them will say something like, oh, I'll buy a new TV, get new trucks for or new tires for the truck, or, whatever. Me, I. I thought money wasn't important. Then let about a week go by and say, hey, pretend you had a rich uncle who just kicked the bucket, left you a bunch of money. What do you do with it? Oh, I'd build a homeless shelter for vets. I'd get a private nurse for my mom so she doesn't have to get into a home. Well, wait a second. Now that you have more than enough, you're not greedy? See, this is how we've twisted it. We've actually convinced ourselves that if I get more than I need, then I'm greedy. What? If you get more than what you need, that's when you actually can start giving. You can't give until you have excess, which is why the parable of the woman with the 2 widows' mites is such a powerful parable. Because people have to say, well, look, she was poor and she gave. She was actually wealthier than over 90% of this country. Because what do we know biblically? If she was in debt, she'd be in debtor's jail. So she wasn't in debt. So even though she only had 2 widows' mites, 90% of this country is in debt. So that woman was actually in a stronger financial position with excess than most people watching this program. But yet we've twisted and lied to ourselves. And we said, oh, well, I'm doing better because I can charge it and I can get a mortgage. And where are any of these things in Scripture? The Bible tells us do not be the debtor. Yet, what do we do with our churches? Well, we need a new church. Let's go get a mortgage. What? He would rather have you poor teaching under a fig tree than to have a church that's in debt. Yet we don't see that. And then we wonder why we have the problem. And instead of addressing the problem, people are going to yell at me and say, oh, well, how dare you? But they can't yell too often because they got to go to bed to make sure they're up for work in the morning.
Go ahead.
I was going to share, that was our goal. My husband and I's goal in 2017 was to completely get out of debt. So, and I can say that we are, which is a huge accomplishment. I mean, 100%, because we felt that way too, was you're not supposed to be the debtor, which we got ourselves in there. But I mean, we're just utterly grateful that we have that financial freedom at this point to say that we're debt free and hopefully never get back into debt.
And that brings us to our next question. The thought is then that, well, because we have all these twists in our thinking. That right now we think, well, entrepreneurship is for those special few that have those special skills, and if you have the right luck, maybe you'll make it. But you say entrepreneurship is for every family.
Yes, every single family. I don't care if you're from Yale or jail. I don't care if you're white or black. I don't care if you're handicapped or it doesn't matter. Entrepreneurship is actually the great equalizer. I said this last time that I was on with Michael, and it's a great example. The first female millionaire in this country, not only was she a female, which is hard enough, she was a black woman in the 1800s. So you start thinking, well, how is that even possible? She was an entrepreneur. That entrepreneurship equalizes things. We had black landowners, we had black slave owners, but they were entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurship, regardless of where you're at, is always the great equalizer. And it gives you the ability to keep up with inflation. Inflation has been 10% every year since 1871. Documented it in the book. It's been a 3-time Amazon #1 bestseller. Never been discredited. It has been 10% every year on average since 1871, which means if you are an employee who gets a 4% cost of living increase, you went backwards 6%. And if you don't believe me, just look up the dollar index. Prove I'm wrong. Look it up right now. And if you looked it up today, like I did before we came out here, your dollar is worth 6% less than it was at the start of last year. So automatically, you just lost 6% there, even if everything I said was wrong. So you need to get to this point where we start saying to ourselves, what are we doing? Let's say somebody watching disagreed with everything. Fine. But why are you going to work for money and abandoning the things that are supposed to be more important? You can't spin that. And that's why it's for every family. It allows you the opportunity to keep up with inflation, and it allows you the at least potential to get beyond where you are right now. And I'm not saying if you're a servant to money, you're sinning. That's between you and God if you have the option to get out. But my point is everybody has the option to get out. People tell me all the time, oh, well, there's so much regulation. How can somebody be an entrepreneur in today's America? Folks, you can be an entrepreneur in prison. If you've ever known anybody who's been to prison, not yourself, wink, wink, but if you've ever known anybody else who's gone to prison, there's somebody in there that can get you a girly magazine, pack of cigarettes, cell phone, drugs, whatever, right? If that person can be an entrepreneur in an 8x8 steel box under 24-hour surveillance, don't tell me you can't be. And when we talk about things like the mark of the beast and you can't buy or sell without the mark, guess what the only thing God can use to help you around that system is? Entrepreneurship. Because it's going to be the black market at that point, but it's still a form of entrepreneurship that he's going to use in order to get you past the mark of the beast system.
So how does someone choose then? You say, okay, great, you got me fired up now. What do I do? What skill, how do I choose what skill I have to turn into a business? How does someone decide that?
Well, step one is you don't go to where you think you would knee-jerk go. Knee-jerk reaction is to start a business in something you know, like, or desire.
So I can't own my vineyard? Because that's my next goal.
Not if it's the business that you're hoping that just gets you free. I had a guy tell me once that, Josh, can you help me start a business? I said, sure. What do you want to do? Well, I want to own a bed and breakfast. I said, great. Do you have $300,000 that I don't know about? He says, well, no. I said, well, then don't do it. Well, see, I knew it took money to make money. No, it took money to own a bed and breakfast. And that's where we kind of get this picture wrong. When I ask them, what business do you want to start? They always tell me something that they desire, the passion, the end goal business, maybe the vineyard. But that's not where you start. You start at what can I start today with what I have that gets me out of employment. And everybody can do that. I've helped homeless people do it. I've helped 94-year-olds do it. I've helped people in wheelchairs do it. It doesn't matter. Everybody can start that sort of business because it's not limited by what just you can do. You start getting involved in real entrepreneurship, and in some cases, you don't provide the labor at all. You just provide the facility or the training or the space or the computer or something that allows the engine to run. And for that, you get a part. And sometimes you just start with a part. But a little bit is better than nada, right? And that little thing can grow because now you have something that God can bless. And it's amazing how entrepreneurship has been such a blessing. And I'm not a theologian. Like somebody's going to say, well, it was actually, this verse instead of Matthew. That's not the point. The point is, from an economic standpoint, I do know what we're talking about. And where we find ourselves is a very perilous position. And as long as Christianity goes down this path of blind employment, we are going to continue to suffer.
Well, I'd like to know your opinion on where is our economy today? It's a new year, it's 2018. what can we expect?
Well, let me put on my little hat and make a prediction, right? I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a rise in alternative currencies because people are realizing, hey, wait a second, the American economic system is based on a bubble. Nobody's denying that the stock market right now is a bubble. It's overvalued.
Yes.
Even though everybody's happy and yay, record numbers, it's still overvalued. I mean, when you have Tesla, a company that I like, but when you have Tesla that is valued higher than General Motors, who is actually selling way more cars, there's a bubble. And it is going to correct itself. So you're going to see a rise of alternative currencies. Some are hour-based, some are crypto-based, but there's lots of them. You're going to see a rise of that. You're also going to see a call for more massive employment, which is always a bad sign. I don't care how people vote politically, but when both parties are saying, hey, we want to be the party of bringing mass employment back and jobs, that can only consume an economy. No economy can last more than 3 generations if it's based on employment. We are now in that 3rd generation. So what I would say is that the people watching this program and reading their scriptures are going to have to look for a godly solution. And that godly solution is to start creating a culture, which is something we don't have. You know, Christians look no different than non-Christians, right? So we'll create our own culture, and in that, start creating our own economy too. And we see it throughout cultures. I mean, I was just meeting with one of our associates who is from India. And he says, well, in India, we don't have to go to the banks. We have what's called a chitty. And a chitty is where they have people in their community all pour into a pot. Let's say everybody pours in $1,000. So now there's $50,000 in a pot. So now we have $50,000 to start business 1. Now next month, we have $50,000 to start business 2. And he says, this is why my culture has so many entrepreneurs. This is why you don't see a lot of us working at the stores for 10 to 20 hours, $20 an hour. We're all starting businesses. So we have to get to that. And that, if we see that in 2018, it's going to be a good year.
That's actually very common in the Latin American community as well. So I've actually done it a handful of times with me and 10 other people. When we do it for 10 months, we all commit to $1,000. And at the end of it, you get $10,000. But it's a huge chunk of money that you can do whatever you want with. So,
and you know, that almost brings to light the wrong thinking we have in America about independence.
Yes.
Everybody being independent. We're not independent. We need to be interdependent, where everyone puts something in so that we can all benefit eventually.
Well, and that's why God created tribes. I mean, you have to remember when Israel wanted a king, he actually said, don't do it. Don't do the king thing. Don't do it. He created tribes, and tribes work exactly like that. And that's why we see cultures who come into America are so successful when they stay tribal. They stay tribal on purpose, and it allows them to thrive. And we need to get back to that. Instead of arguing about, well, I love my job. Well, stop it for a second. Even if you do, which I disagree with, but even if you do, what are you doing to promote the culture, your beliefs? I mean, for goodness sakes, you referenced the comparison I made in the book. In prison, they give you a Bible. Well, in all 50 states, you're not supposed to take a Bible to work. So tell me again how this is what you love so much. We have to get back to that cultural, tribal society and use entrepreneurship to our advantage.
Thank you, Josh. Well, you know what? Time's up for this episode, but come back because we're not done here in the least. So we're going to come back, and next time we're going to talk about the meaning of life, and that is where we're going to start our next episode of Shabbat Night Live. Until then, we thank you, Josh, for being with us, and thank you, Anny, for asking all those great questions, and I can't wait to learn more, and I bet you can't either. So until then, until next week, we'll bid you shalom, shavua tov, and we'll see you next time on Shabbat Night Live.
Like this video? Watch more at michaelrood.tv.